Welcome to Book Rising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective.
Hi all, welcome back to Book Rising and Radical Publishing Futures. I'm your host, Meg Arenberg, and I'm here in the studio today with Fazeela Jiwa, who is a freelance writer and editor with interests in social justice and radical politics, and who is also acquisitions and development editor for the Nova Scotia-based independent press, Fernwood Publishing. Welcome, Fazeela.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
We really appreciate you taking the time to chat. So the Radical Books Collective got connected to Fernwood through the Radical Publishers Alliance, which I know you've been very active in as a press. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of the story of how Fernwood got started, or how you first got involved with Fernwood. I imagine you weren't there right at the founding in 1992.
No, I was very young in 1992, but I started at Fernwood 2017, so just 5 years ago, and it's had a lot of changes since I've been involved. So I kind of feel like, in a way, I'm a part of this kind of new iteration of what the press is now. But yeah, it was founded 30 years ago by Errol Sharpe, who is still around and still editing and still doing all of the amazing things that he does. My kid calls him Socialist Santa Claus. So that kind of gives you it. But basically, he started the company. I think it was a distribution company first, and sales. So he would go around doing, direct sales in the hallways of universities, talking to scholars, because it was mostly academic books. And a few times he said that some of the people who he's talking to were saying, I wish that there was a book like this that I could teach with. This part is missing, in this field. And he would say, well, why didn't you write it then? And then publish that book. And actually, based on that, the successes of those first kind of one-off books, that's how it became, Fernwood Books became a Fernwood Publishing. And then there was a distribution arm, which recently has closed down. Which is sad, because that aspect of the publishing industry is really important as well to in terms of having a radical anti-capitalist approach. But it's also been really good to focus on, the acquisitions and editing and production of the books.
And I know that, as you said, Fernwood sort of started out focusing on academic texts, on scholarly texts, and has kind of expanded from there into broader general audiences, and even into fiction as opposed to nonfiction. Is that right? I mean, so
right.
Part of the, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the fiction, we have a literary imprint called Roseway Publishing, and that's where fiction and creative nonfiction, even poetry, some children's books, that's where that kind of takes place. Although I'd say that now really we're starting to spend more time on the acquisitions and editing aspect of those kinds of more literary texts. Mm-hmm. Whereas Fernwood, the main group, it's mostly I think that it used to be very focused on academics, as you say, but these days, and I feel like this is, we've gotten more interested or more engaged with trade or non-specialized audiences, and I think partly that's because the desire of people who are not specialists for this kind of critical information has been growing with, the clusterfuck of the world also growing. So I think that's part of it. And then another part of it is, I'm really interested personally in making these kinds of critiques accessible, and that means language should be accessible and not jargony, and they should be shorter than a giant tome of a textbook, because, or they should be they can be multi-genre, because different ways of writing get to different audiences. So I'm very excited about that personally, and I'm really fortunate that Fernwood is also interested in that. So yeah, there's been some changes in that regard as well. But of course, the academic books that we produce are still kind of the mainstay of the publishing company.
So what does that acquisition process look like now? I mean, are you still sort of chatting with academics and asking them what they want to see and then telling them to write write books about it? Or
actually, yes. Yes. I think, well, we kind of find books two ways. For the first way is through acquisitions, and I would say we have I think the editors in Fernwood, I think, have really strong relationships with their communities, locally, but also, I would say nationally, internationally. I think we're all pretty active in movements and struggles, and so that kind of creates a natural relationship with the people that we want to write with and who we want to read our books. So we go to a lot of public events. We put on public events. We go to conferences. We read very widely, not just in academic journals, but radical magazines, or lots of doom scrolling on Twitter, which has, I think, during the pandemic, the acquisitions process has moved a lot more online, but it hasn't been so bad, actually. It's really, I think, expanded access for a lot of people. So that has been, I found, really great. And then the other way that we find books, or that books come to us, I guess, is through submissions, cold submissions. We get about, between the literary imprint Roseway and Fernwood, we get about 600 cold submissions a year, and we're able to publish approximately 30 books a year. So I would say the process of kind of going through that is, it's a bit more hit and miss than, direct acquisitions, because it's someone who we don't have a previous relationship with. And for that, I would say that we look for things that are, I kind of feel like weird saying new, because that, this original work is, I feel like, sometimes fetishized in the publishing industry. Whereas really what we're looking for is a different, not necessarily new take on existing information. So an underheard perspective, I would say, on challenging, critiquing, and pushing the status quo. Yeah, often that kind of cutting edge thinking comes from the margins. So we publish a lot of work by, and we work very, I think we have a very strong editorial process. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have experience in writing or know anything about publishing to be able to work with an indie press, and with Fernwood, and specifically because editors will support you in that process, and I've done that several times. So there's kind of a bunch of different kinds of books that we publish, and I think that what they all have in common is that they I would say, understand the possibility of transformation, and I think that's what makes me passionate about the books that we publish.
I know I noticed in your bio that you're also doing some freelance developmental editing, and it did make me wonder whether or not you're sort of entering the process a little earlier with some authors and sort of developing ideas in kind of coming into their own as first time authors in the course of that acquisition process.
Yeah, actually, I started out with Fernwood as a freelancer, and I don't do it as much anymore because, well, really for personal reasons. I have a kid now who's young and don't have that much time. But really, I'm just interested in radical books, and as you are too, and yeah, I think Fernwood is a good place for me in that way as well, because it's just amazing to find a publishing company that has the same kinds of goals that I do personally.
I know that Fernwood has a particular interest in Aboriginal studies and has published a number of First Nations authors. And I wonder if you could talk at all about that aspect of how Fernwood is shifting or at least deviating from kind of mainstream publishing norms in Canada.
That's a juicy question. I think in terms of Indigenous writers, we have, I think, developed quite a good relationship, a good reputation for having respectful, collaborative editing relationships with Indigenous writers. In Canada, I think, there's definitely a increase in interest and in Indigenous writing, and that's in general a great thing because this group has been so underrepresented in this settler colonial nation since the beginning, and publishing itself has been a nation building endeavor over top of already existing vibrant cultural forms of storytelling. So there's a tension there, I think. Yeah, I hope that it's not that it continues, that it deepens, that there is a diversity of voices and not just what people want to hear. For our part, we don't have an Indigenous editor on staff. We will definitely we are working toward that. We do work with freelance development editors and copy editors and designers, and the whole process involves Indigenous people, especially if it's a text by Indigenous authors. Mm-hmm. So it's an area I think that publishing in Canada has been working really hard to address with varying success, I would say, across the industry.
Yeah.
But I think it's safe to feel kind of proud of the relationships that Fernwood has been able to build. I can give an example of one book that we recently published called, it was a biography of Doug Knockwood, who is a Mi'kmaq elder. And the process of writing that book, he is gone now, but throughout the process of writing that book, it took years and years, and it's because the editor and the author developed this long-term relationship so that the book could be as accurate to the experience of hearing the Doug Knockwood stories as possible, and that it was a mutually respectful relationship. So I'm also interested in hearing what other publishers have been doing and thinking in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, since you mentioned the challenge of marketing critical texts or texts that might not be all entirely celebratory. I wonder if we could shift to talking about readership a little bit. I think the Fernwood tagline has something about critical books for critical readers, or something something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what critical readers means to you, how you characterize Fernwood's readership, and where they're found. Where do you find them? What does Fernwood's marketing look like?
That's a really good question. I feel like, the people who, I'm an editor at Fernwood, so the people who do the marketing in Fernwood would have so much more to say than I would. But in general, I would say that our main audience is still an academic audience. That's kind of the bread and butter of this work. We publish a lot of textbooks, like supplemental texts, especially where especially in fields, I would say, that are traditionally quite conservative, like social work or sociology, or political economy in general. So that's, I think, a really important intervention, and that's the beginning of what Fernwood has been and has continued to be throughout, has been kind of trying to provide that critical take on, in a space in the university which is colloquially known as the ivory towers, right? It's not an accessible space. Right. And so to destabilize that a little bit with texts that are affordable, especially for students. We try to keep our textbooks way less than what a normal, regular multinationally published textbook would cost. And that's because of access. So like I said before, I think that this audience is expanding because of people's general interest in having access to this kind of understanding. You don't have to be a student to be interested in prison abolition, right? So I think that's the other audience that we have, which are people who are doing this work and who are affected by these the issues that we publish about. So we have a lot of readers who are activists. We have a lot of readers who are professionals in the fields, and also an increasing trade presence, I would say.
You mentioned how sort of reaching potential authors has changed in the era of social media, and particularly during the pandemic, maybe. But how else have things changed for Fernwood in the age of digital publishing? I mean, has it all been net positives for the press as things have shifted to ebooks and digital ordering and on-demand printing and all those kinds of things?
I would say it's definitely not all. There are some positives. I think that for every positive that I'm thinking about, there's also kind of a opposing challenge. But in general, the pace is so much faster with digital publishing than print publishing. And so with that comes expectations to have all of the information about your book on the internet as soon as possible in all of the different venues. So that really, I think that pits us against larger publishers in a way that is not always positive, but it also gives us access to worldwide audiences, like in a way that we never had before as well. And then when we talk about digital publishing, I think about two things. I think about accessibility again. there's born accessible texts, and we're working really hard to catch up with that, because we hadn't done a lot of digital publishing before the pandemic, before this demand for access, which I think in general is a really good thing. So we're thinking about how, what are the best practices in writing alt text, for example? Mm-hmm. How can it be an enhancement rather than something that's understood as like an extra tack on kind of thing? So the alt text is engaging and just, hilarious or beautifully written in the same way that the text itself would be, right? So it's part of the text as opposed to something extra. So these kinds of thinking are the kind of thinking that I think digital publishing enables around accessibility is very exciting. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I think about, which is kind of a sticky topic, is copyright, because it's sticky for me because I'm very sympathetic to the idea of the Creative Commons and to have information sharing, especially radical and challenging critiques of the status quo. I think that should be available. But at the same time, we are an anti-capitalist company working in a capitalist market. And so I think it's necessary for us to, I just understand deeply that writers and indie publishers and everybody who works on those books still need to get paid for the work that they're doing to be able to continue doing it. So, we have tried to sort through these issues about digital rights management in a way that kind of balances both the need to share information as well as the need for fair compensation for creating this work. And especially because, as you talked about, in the LitHub article that was recently published, if we don't have that kind of, if we're not able to financially float indie publishers and radical authorship, then the diversity of the kinds of information we're getting will be greatly diminished, because multinationals are just not going to be able to create that and may not even have an interest in that, right? So we try to do lots of things that, in terms of trying to get the information out there, that, we have some creative solutions that we're still working on. I would be really happy to hear what other people have been doing to try to offer lots of free copies. Like, for example, we've done a lot of texts on policing and prisons recently, and all of those texts are hopefully going to be in prison libraries. Those are the people who they are written about and for, so they should have access to them. So kind of examples like this are where we're trying to circumvent this tension a little bit, at the same time as, expecting the professors who read our books to pay for them. People who have stable jobs and are able to participate in that kind of market should.
Yeah.
And
enable those other kinds of efforts of the publisher, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we make a buck, that's going to be put toward creating another book.
Right.
Hopefully, like an earth-shattering one,
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, speaking of multinationals and corporate giants, one question we've been asking all the publishers we've talked to is how you deal with or how you address these big, enormous, these behemoths of Amazon and Barnes and Noble and so forth, the sellers and the distributors that are sort of, how do you tackle these kinds of giants?
Yeah, this is, a question for the times, right? I think a lot of people are dealing with it. I've heard of, publishers I very much admire, part of the Radical Publishers Alliance, where they have just decided not to deal with Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Is we haven't been able to do that at Fernwood, and I guess the way that we deal with that is to build, again, we come back to local relationships all the time, right? So indie booksellers, local booksellers, to have really strong relationships with those kinds of distributors in our communities. I think that is a great way to do that. We encourage our authors not to link to their book on Amazon, and instead, either link to the publisher's page or direct people to their local bookstore. We've done some thinking around trying to find creative solutions to shipping costs, where, again, it's an issue of access. So the person who's in the city where the publisher, where the distributor is, doesn't have more access to the book than someone, in the far north who has to pay extra for shipping. So there's some ways I think that we can try to work around Amazon and large distributors like that, but it's just very difficult to fight them in this environment, especially when your authors really want their work to get out there, and may not necessarily understand or care about the ethics of distribution. So
yeah, and on the question of accessibility, it's always fraught, I think. I mean, Amazon does allow for a certain amount of accessibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Hard to deny. So sort of thinking then, out of all of these things we've been talking about and the overarching questions, what do you think would have to change for independent, radical, non-corporate publishing to thrive?
Such a good question. Such a big question. I feel like we could talk for like 3 days about this, but maybe we should. Maybe we should create some sort of,
3-day workshop. I'm down.
I think one of the things that we've been struggling with and thinking through recently has been the role of a radical publisher, a radical independent publisher, in, I guess, I don't like to say knowledge production, but like, creating access to understanding and ideas that are challenging, harmful structures that we live in. And one of the things that we keep coming up against is this, a lot of writers with really radical ideas, a lot of thinkers and doers, who are clearly against these kinds of harmful structures, including capitalism and other oppressive ways that we organize this society, somehow don't apply the same critique to publishing as an industry. And it just feels like an exception, right? And maybe it's because of this kind of status and prestige economy, especially in academic publishing, where your ideas are only seen as worthy if they are published by this like huge corporate publisher or the biggest university press, and then there's this material aspect to that too, because they can offer bigger advances than an indie publisher, for example, right? So we struggle with kind of thinking about how transformational, all of the work from the words on the page to the way that it's produced I would like for it to embody this kind of transformational culture that we are hoping to create. but it just feels like a bit of a challenge for us to explore with people, the people who we write with and the people who we'd like to write with, publish with. And I guess it's just, I think that radical politics often see the page because indies take chances on new and innovative radical material. And when it becomes mainstream, in a way, I think of that as a job well done, that's kind of the goal, right? But at the same time, it really feels a bit tender, I would say, or a bit sore to see a publisher, who never gave a fuck about these issues to begin with, make tons of profit off of it, when you know that if we were the ones making the profit off of it, we would be using that to make more books and like support more authors, especially the ones who are not going to be picked up by a mainstream press.
Yeah.
It's just a uncomfortable topic, I would say, because I understand both, kind of like the digital marketing and copyright issue. I understand both sides, and often when I think about things as both sides, I always understand that there's, the binary is always a hint that there's something else there, right? Because maybe that's too abstract, but like there must be ways around this. And I think that a lot of us have found ways around this and just dealing with what we do, as related. What I'm talking about is, again, being an anti-capitalist company in the form of a company in a capitalist environment. It poses a lot of these problems because there is various forms of capital, money, cultural capital that we all need to live with and figure out for ourselves. So it's just some of the thinking aloud that I have been doing myself and with a few trusted colleagues in the past.
Yeah. I mean, it's true even for us at Radical Books Collective. We're so committed to having our conversations be accessible. We want book clubs to be a free space. And then also we want to be able to keep doing what we're doing. And so kind of finding the line between, what allows us to sustain the work without sort of, recreating these harmful structures that exclude and limit and
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, tell us what's up and coming at Fernwood that our listeners should definitely have an eye out for. What should we be reading?
This is a hard question because I like all these books, but I'll talk about two that I had a hand in working on. So the first one is called Abolitionist Intimacies by Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a poet, a teacher, and a prison justice activist, long time, Black feminist, who has been active in her community. And this book, it's just really close to my heart because it has all of the things that we've been talking about. It's very accessible. It's multi-genre. So it's poetry, which she does as spoken word. So there will be, recordings of her reading the book. I think there's going to be an audiobook too. And that it's scholarly because there's parts of it that are scholarly, because a lot of the field of writing around prison justice has been kind of theoretical, and so she takes that on as well in the form that it is requiring. And there's also some journalism and like, narrative essay style work. So, and all of it just is so personal and it's so material. Like she describes a lot of her experiences going into jails, and she has taken care to ask the people who she's writing about if they want to be featured in this book. And when they say yes, it's just so powerful, the way that she's able to think about their experiences, but also her experience as an advocate. And how, like, one of the last chapter is called "What is Desire to the Abolitionist?" And so she also grapples with some of the themes that we've been talking about in this conversation around wanting nice things and wanting to have a comfortable life, and then at the same time thinking, what role does pleasure have in this kind of work, and joy and all of these kinds of things. How does that relate to our being imbued in these systems, and how does it relate to our freedom? So it's really powerful, really beautiful book, and yeah, I encourage everybody to read it. And the other one, which is very different, it's called Frequently Asked White Questions, and which the acronym for that is FAWQ, so FOC. And so the introduction is called "For Foc's Sake." It's very humorous and accessible. So it's very short, really small, kind of cute little pink book, and it's basically a primer for people who are interested in conversations about race but feel awkward or embarrassed, or maybe someone has asked you the same question, maybe you're a racialized person and someone's asked you the same question 20 times and you're sick and tired of answering it. So this is the book that is like, it's meant to be very accessible. Part of the thing that makes it accessible is that there's hardly any jargon. When there is jargon or specialized language, there's a glossary, there's a reading list, and the authors are really funny. So the way that this book came about is that the two authors, who are Ajay Parasram and Alex Kasnabish, who are professors here in Halifax, where I live, they kind of embarked on this public education project, which they understand as a de-radicalizing project for white people who might feel embarrassed or shy to ask these questions, or maybe they've been, they've said the wrong thing and been shouted down about it or something like this. So their space was called Safe Space for White Questions, which is kind of a cheeky thing that they've done. But during the pandemic, it stopped, and then we ended up doing it online. And so it's a live monthly show on YouTube where people can ask questions anonymously and they will answer them without any, it's their opinions, but they're very open about it. So it's not like they're thinking that their thinking is the correct way, but it's just a space to, have conversations about this. And while we were doing the online sessions over 2 years, I kind of got frustrated because I was thinking the same questions keep coming up. Like, it's the same, you're answering the same kinds of questions every episode or over the course of them. And so they responded to my frustration with this very wise understanding of, this repetition is the way that we understand things. And the fact that people are asking the same kinds of questions means that these are the key themes that people want to think about when it comes to race. And then I was like, why don't we do a book about that? So we're doing the top 10 themes of questions that they've been asked on the show, and they've just distilled it into 5 to 8 pages per chapter. Each chapter is a different question. And it'll be paired with the show going forward in September. So that's going to be really exciting as well.
That sounds great. What's an example of one of those questions? Like what, just one of the themes that continually comes up.
Can you be racist against white people, for example?
Right.
Or, for another example, what's the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? Kinds of things that I think everybody struggles with, regardless of your race, really. Like, the book is directed toward white people, but I think it will be useful to anyone.
Yeah.
Thinking about it as a couple of the ways in which they talk about it is not necessarily about white fragility, but about building racial resilience, which I really liked, because that's really what we're getting to, right? So you can have you feel prepared to have conversations about race and to act in anti-racist ways without feeling that kind of limiting or scary, emotion of being,
visually attacked or something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fear, and it's being offended, or So yeah, this is an example of like a book that we're going to be. It's a trade book. It's a general audience book, and probably I think it might be used in some courses as well, as an academic book, but it's not meant to be an academic book. It's meant to take these kinds of conversations around racial politics that are happening in activist spaces and scholarly spaces and translate them into a way that everybody can understand.
Awesome. Fazeela, thank you so much for your time. This has been such a great conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to be part of this, and I just support the work that you guys do so much. So anything I can do to help it out, I'm down.